Hello, hello, and welcome. We've still got a few minutes left to go, but good evening. My name is Dr. Christian Reynolds. I'm here at the thriving Centre for Food Policy. Just it's gone 5:15 now, and so most of everybody else has packed up and gone home for the night. But we're here for a Food Thinkers. We're going to wait a few more minutes just for people to start coming in. But come in, please. Be sure you're welcome here for tonight's Food Thinkers. So just waiting to see everybody else coming on in. It is lovely to see so many of you here for tonight's Food Thinkers. We'll just give it another 60 seconds or so before we begin. So tonight we have a very exciting guest, but first I will go through a few housekeeping notices while everybody is still coming on in to the Zoom meeting. Yep, the number keeps on rising, which is always lovely. So welcome to tonight's September 2023 Food Thinkers with the title of Past Approaches for Future Food. We're now just going to read out a few housekeeping notices before we begin. So now just a reminder, we are now offering the option to join our MSc in Food Policy in January 2024. In the past, we've only had one intake, which is in September, October, but we now have a January intake to the MSc as well, and applications are now open to that. If you put links into the chat box right now, if you're interested in our MSc in Food Policy. There's also the continuing professional development courses, and if you wanted to start next week on the 25th of September, the continuing professional development courses are the first module of the Food Policy Masters, and that's still open until the end of this week. So if you're really raring to go and impassioned by tonight's Food Thinkers and excited by food policy in general, please do check out the CPD if you want to start this month, or January for the full MSc in Food Policy, which can be done in person in London or via distance anywhere on the planet. I'm also highlighting, as you probably are aware, that we're on Zoom, and this webinar is being recorded and will be made online available afterwards via our amazing YouTube channel. I do encourage you to go and check out the YouTube channel if you can. Hopefully, again, the links are in the subscription. Please like and subscribe our videos when you're there. It's got an archive of many years of Food Thinkers there now, and it's an amazing resource for everybody to listen to how thoughts on the food system from some of the brightest stars of food policy and food systems thinking. Now, to tonight specifically, I encourage you to write your questions into the Q&A box, which will be on the bottom of your screen in the Zoom interface. Please write them as you think of them. Do not put them in the chat box. I'll be triaging them and grouping them and reading them out to Eleanor after she's given her talk. We will try and respond to all of your questions if we have the time available. If you would like to tweet about tonight's talk, please use the hashtag #FoodThinkers and the handle @FoodPolicyCity. You can find us on Twitter, hopefully in the link going into the chat box now. Our next Food Thinkers will be on Wednesday, 25th of October, when we will be joined by Audrey Bennett and Jennifer Vuken for a talk on how to use design to critically map sustainable food outcomes. Registrations for this talk will be open in the next few days. I'm really excited to hear what Audrey and Jennifer have to say about how design intersects with food systems. It's going to be an amazing talk. And finally, if you don't yet receive our monthly newsletter, but would like to know more about next month's Food Thinkers, as well as the wider food policy and other events that we're hosting, please do sign up to the Centre for Food Policy mailing list. A link will be also appearing in the chat box now. So lots of links in the chat box, lots of action to happen. But now let's get to it. Let's introduce Eleanor Boyle. So Eleanor Boyle is a Canadian food writer focusing on how food systems can support climate, health, and justice. She's been studying the wartime food program for a number of years. Eleanor has extensive connections to the UK, firstly being a grandchild of a West Midlands grocer, and more recently as a press fellow at Cambridge University, and as well as an alumni of City University Masters in Food Policy. It's great to have Eleanor here tonight. Eleanor also holds degrees in behavioural sciences and neuroscience, and has been a long-time journalist. She authored High Stakes, Why and How to Eat Less Meat in 2012, and more recently, Mobilise Food, wartime inspiration for environmental victory today in 2022. I'm really excited to welcome Eleanor tonight to give her presentation for this most exciting Food Thinkers. So please, Eleanor, go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I, like yourself, have been wondering what it's going to take for our societies to really address the climate crisis and food systems. And when I think about this and wonder about it, I think of what I learned from studying the remake of food in World War II Britain. And that is that the project was bold. The nation knew that it was in an emergency and it acted like it. The food programs were unprecedented. They were daring, and they created a system that asked much of everyone. There were controversies, there were conflicts, and the project made plenty of mistakes, but it produced stirring results. So I'll outline the wartime food story as built on bold approaches. I'll say a few words about relevance to today, and then I'll ask whether we might emulate wartime resolve by regulating foods that undermine climate, environment, and human well-being. So, a little context. In the late 1930s, Nazi aggression was threatening Europe. Britain was likely to be drawn into war and even invaded. And preparation would need to include for food because war can wreck food systems. 70% of what British citizens were eating in the late 1930s was also coming in on ships from overseas, and those ships would now be threatened and torpedoed. Domestic agriculture at the same time was depressed and unproductive, with good arable land simply being used to graze cattle and sheep. And fully half the population was already deficient in either calories or at least essential nutrients, according to a 1936 report from the eminent John Boyle. And it is hard to win a war if you're hungry. So the government moved to manage the entire food system. And that is my first identified bold approach: more government leadership. There would be room for private business at numerous levels of the food system, but government would set policy and be the sole importer and buyer of foods. A Ministry of Food was reinvigorated, and they soon found a business person, Lord Woolton, who headed up and start organizing plans to rationalize imports, maximize domestic food production, and establish a range of measures in hopes that the entire population of almost 50 million people would be able to access basic foods. So price controls, school food, workers' canteens in factories, and national or so-called British restaurants dotted around the country, eventually over 2,000 of them, where anyone could get an inexpensive meal with no ration coupons, as in this image from the county of Kent. The government needed to inform and motivate, so posters urged people to be part of the project, help win the war on the kitchen front, plan your meals to avoid waste. Food leaders were numerous, along with Lord Woolton, and one of my favorites is Marguerite Patton, Ministry of Food home economist, who became very well known around the country as she traveled to help people understand the rules and learn to make decent meals with limited supplies. I have a few of her recipes were particularly piquing to me, including her cabbage casserole and I think my very favorite, her oatmeal soup. So the first bold move was more government leadership, and a second was more mandates. What do I mean by that? Well, farming needed a reboot. This is what much of it looked like at the time, many more horses than tractors. And more importantly, a lot of good arable land not being used to potential. So agricultural potential was assessed and regional farm committees set up all around the country to give directives to farmers. And this is my point. This was not a voluntary exercise. Farmers were required to cull some livestock, focus more on human edible crops, plant specific crop species, and aim for ambitious yields or face expropriation of their lands. Food waste was to be addressed at every level of the system. From farmers to urban dwellers, people were urged to not waste food. We want your kitchen waste. A clear plate means a clear conscience, and I rather like that terminology, which we would never hear today in public life. Wasting food, actually, once again, was absolutely not allowed, and this was not a voluntary exercise. Wasting food became illegal. They were so intent on saving every morsel of food in the country that they used tactics that sound a little heavy-handed to us. For example, one woman living in Bristol named Mary Bridget O'Sullivan was seen feeding bread to the birds and fined 10 pounds, which is quite a bit more than the weekly wage at the time. Then there was rationing. Again, not a voluntary exercise. Everyone needed to take part. Rationing applied not just to food items, of course, but to fuel and other goods, but began just a few months into the war with bacon, butter, and sugar immediately limited, available to everyone, but limited in amount. And of course, rationing was compulsory. So my second identified bold move was more mandates. And my third is more engagement. It was a national project for survival, and everyone was expected to play a part in producing and conserving food. So posters of the time on the left urged women to join the Women's Land Army. Now, this was not mandatory, but very popular. Many, many thousands of women came out of their typing jobs and their other work and joined the Women's Land Army to help solve the labor problem on farms. And the next two posters are urging people to, should they have any holiday time, to spend it on a farm planting carrots or harvesting potatoes. So inspiration for all of this was delivered, of course, by Winston Churchill and also by Lord Woolton, who had a personal warmth. According to Liverpool historian Bryce Evans, he actually had working class roots, despite the title. And a lot of characteristics that endeared him to people. He insisted on delivering bad news himself, for example, and would frequently come on the wireless or the radio to explain why the bacon ration had to be cut. Citizens actually wrote fan letters to him, knowing that he was born Frederick Marcus. They'd write, "Dear Uncle Fred, dear Uncle Fred, thank you for the food my son is receiving at school." So engagement was encouraged by individuals and by messaging everywhere. Sometimes using a little humor. Better potluck with Churchill today than humble pie under Hitler tomorrow. And of course, the iconic dig for victory. Children, too, had to be persuaded to simple meals. So cartoon characters were invented, celebrating produce that could be grown in the backyard, which was very useful, especially on the carrot front here, when a wartime scarcity of ice cream meant that a common wartime treat was carrot on a stick. So my third identified bold move was more engagement. So how did it go? Well, there were difficulties. There were definitely problems. There were downsides. There were queues. And there were fears. Food import ships, which were still coming in, were being sunk regularly, leading people to to recognize that the human toll, because there were personnel on those ships, but also over the course of the war, millions of tons of goods, much of it food, went to the bottom of the English Channel or the Atlantic. So there was fear. And there was hunger, especially in cities. I mean, people got enough to eat, but not much more. I gave a talk on this to a group of seniors in my city of Vancouver, numerous of whom were in Britain during the war. And one man stood at the end and he was shaking and he said, "I was hungry all the time." And I was very moved and actually felt that I had not sufficiently publicly recognized his pain. I think it's also a bit of a warning to all of us who do research that behind the metrics, and we know this, but we forget, I think, behind the metrics are human beings and sometimes pain. There were also inequalities internationally. Britain did not sufficiently help its colonies, including the Indian province of Bengal, which suffered a terrible famine mid-war. But Britain prioritized, as critics point out, feeding instead its own largely white population. Domestically, there were also inequities. There was some black market, though it really was small scale compared with in continental countries. And the wealthy found ways to get more, although the Ministry of Food tried hard to close loopholes. But on the positive side, the Dig for Victory campaign was enormously successful. Millions of allotment gardens were started and tended to, including this one some of you will recognize the Albert Memorial, this one in Hyde Park. Yes, public parks were torn up for food. And the food programs helped maintain citizen morale, which was key, especially in a protracted war, which went on and on and on for 6 years. And really domestically, everyone was fed. Just enough in some cases, but everyone was fed. For millions, that meant they were fed better than pre-war. And some of the co-benefits were surprising. Population health actually in many ways improved. People were eating better, which played a very real role in declines in tuberculosis, a scourge at the time, diabetes, and other chronic illnesses. Maternal and child health improved markedly, especially in the poorest demographic groups. There wasn't much sugar to eat, so people's dental health even improved. And though environment was not an objective and climate was certainly not on anyone's lips, environment was not an objective. Ultimately, wartime diets were more local, more plant-based, and with much less waste, which sounds like the start of sustainable diets. So I want to say a few things about relevance to today. Could we and should we have more government leadership in our food systems? Should we and could we mandate some shifts in food production and consumption? Should we and how can we inspire more engagement? So to the first, how much government is a question of political philosophy that never has an easy or a universal answer. But given that our food systems are, as Jennifer Clapp and others have pointed out in this space, are dominated by corporate interests whose aims are financial, not social, should food systems have more public management? I have been rereading Tony Jute, to whom I was introduced by my historian husband. And Tony Jute comments that our neoliberal political environment encourages us to assume that business does everything better than government. And Tony reminds us that there are some things that business does better than government, but the opposite is true as well. And in his words, we must unapologetically argue and work for more state involvement in such sectors. As he said, memorably to me, you can have too much state, but you can also have too little. We do have examples today of more government-driven food policy, including, of course, in Brazil, in its Zero Hunger Project, and cities there, such as Belo Horizonte, which have restaurantes populares, very much like the wartime British restaurants, where anyone can get an inexpensive meal. And I am told by people who have been there that they really are popular, that they appeal broadly, not simply to low-income people. I'd also like to offer an additional example of more public good in food policy involving Canada's National Food Guide. Last time it was due for revision, we had a particularly courageous federal health minister who told her top officials not to agree to any meetings with corporate food, although that had always been done in the past. They would come knocking to state their case, and they would get meetings with officials, no more. The minister told her officials to tell them that they could come to the public hearings like everybody else. And we got a food guide that is remarkably sustainable and healthy. In fact, it looks a little like the Planetary Health Guide from the Eat Lancet report. And for those involved in policy, I just want to say, this occurred without any transformation of food governance, without any overall sort of all-out changes to legislation or even regulations, but simply to procedure at a level that was open to ministerial interpretation. It gives me a lot to think about, and I hope yourself as well. So we're talking about today, and I want to say a word about mandates. Seth Klein is a Canadian policy analyst who has written about Canada's quick pivot to a crisis economy for World War II to, of course, support Britain in the war. And he comments that when governments are in emergency mode, they move from voluntary or incentive-based measures to mandatory ones. So we need to decide whether or not we should be in emergency mode for climate and for food. I think these days, post-COVID or during COVID, when we imagine mandates, we think of COVID protests, anti-vaxxers who get extensive media attention, leading us to feel that no one wants to be told what to do. Yet oppositional voices are often, I think in most of our jurisdictions, in a small minority. And there are plenty of examples of mandates that have wide social support. As a small example, we all stop at red lights and we don't complain that these are interfering with our personal rights. Now, on the topic of engagement, more and more people are involved in food, such as in the color photo here of these lovely youngsters learning to grow food in my corner of the world. And it reminds me of a beautiful example from World War II in the black and white picture on the left, 1942 London. This lot had been bombed out in the conflict. And what did the neighborhood boys do? They did what they could. They came and dug up the soil for a vegetable garden. Morale was absolutely key in wartime, and participation helped boost that morale. Today, we don't really use the term morale, but most of us know that there is a very real climate anxiety, especially among our precious children and youth. And psychology background assures me that one antidote to anxiety is action. So for my last point, should we set limits on consumption? Should we take inspiration from wartime and boldly limit production or consumption of any problematic foods? Well, livestock for meat and dairy are big problems for food systems, which unfortunately, however, get much less attention than they deserve. This graph shows which protein sources create the most greenhouse gases per 100 grams of protein. The longer the horizontal line, the more greenhouse gases that species produces. Beef is at the top. All of the meats are at the top, showing that they are much much larger contributors to the climate crisis than are plant-based proteins. The basic science has been around for a long time, showing that livestock are also key drivers of deforestation and biodiversity loss, of water pollution, and more. Yet, food and climate researchers have been timid in addressing this topic. I'm happy to see more attention being paid to it now. But let me give you a quick example from 20 years ago. I attended a climate conference of scientists, and they were discussing climate drivers. Nobody had mentioned food, of course. So in the Q&A, I stood up and I think politely asked whether consumers shouldn't eat a little less meat. And one of the scientists on the panel actually stood up and shouted at me and said, I must be some kind of ideological vegetarian, his words. So I actually spoke with him afterwards to apologize or whatever. And he said, I know that livestock and meat are a problem, but if I say so among scientists, I will be considered marginal. So I'm very happy to see that meat, livestock, dairy are getting more attention now. And some of you may have seen this, which came out just in the last month or so in Nature Communications, showing that if we decrease our global meat by 50% production/consumption, that we will almost halt global deforestation and that land use emissions will decline by more than 30%. So how can we proceed? Well, personally, I would like to see more regulation of excessive production. We do think of regulating consumption, and I'm going to talk about this, but I think we have to think about production as well. Companies say that they are merely satisfying increasing consumer demand, increasing global demand. But we need to recognize that producers create a lot of the demand. If you look at the website, for example, for Beef Checkoff, the big beef industry group in the United States, it says right at the top that their job is to create demand for beef, create and maintain. And I'm sorry to say that my own tax dollars go into this, and it may be the same for some of you in your countries. Canada has a large beef industry, which is very unhappy because Canadians have been cutting back on their meat consumption. So my national government, using my tax dollars, last year gave the industry millions of dollars to go and find non-traditional markets, which to me means that people around the world who were perfectly happy not eating beef every day are now being encouraged to do so. So how can we, now that's really production, and I want us to think about that. On the consumption side, of course, one strategy or mechanism is meat taxes, and some jurisdictions are trying this. The obvious initial challenge is meat could become simply a food for the rich, so that taxes probably need to be redistributed in some fashion. And there are European researchers who have produced some excellent papers on this. But as another approach, we could consider meat rationing. It would tick all those three boxes of wartime boldness. It would be publicly administered, it would be mandatory, and it would apply to everyone. So what are some of the arguments for meat rationing? Well, in many of our jurisdictions, meat consumption is down on a voluntary basis, and that's heartening, but simply not enough to tackle the problem. As the Eat Lancet report and others have said, decreases will probably need to be 50%. It will depend where you are, and there is no one number that will apply everywhere, but voluntary decreases are insufficient. Next, rationing sounds radical, but we actually do it all the time. Price could be considered a rationing mechanism. If you want something, you probably have to pay for it, and that's a means of selective allocation. Other examples, in the summer, we have water restrictions. To use the library, you need a library card, and there's a limit on the number of books you can take out. In ecologically sensitive areas, if you want to hike or fish, you'll probably need a permit, because those systems need to be protected as far as the number of people who go into them go. And in hospital emergency wards or A&Es in Britain, you're going to be assessed so that limited medical resources can go to those who need them most. I think that we already selectively allocate it. It may be that we need a less scary word than rationing, and I invite suggestions. Should we ration meat? Of course, amounts would be sustainably determined. And to me, this would give us confidence. I've also argued that we should consider rationing flying and driving. And I'd like to know if I take a flight, whether it's sustainability boundaries, it would be science-based. And the fourth and final argument, it's all about fairness. Rationing is all about fairness. Now, if you're thinking this would never fly, that it would not be acceptable, I understand your concern. A few years ago, I wrote a feature article in Canada's national newspaper, the Globe and Mail, and here you see it on the right. The climate crisis is like a world war. Let's talk about rationing. And I advocated rationing for climate of flying, driving, and meat eating. It generated passionate debate. I actually got 850 online comments, some of them positive, some of them expressing relief at a suggestion for a fair way to limit consumption. But the responses range from relief to disbelief that anyone would make such an outrageous suggestion. More than one respondent said that I must be a communist, and vowed that they would definitely cancel their subscription to the newspaper. Interesting, the use of the word communist. British officials in coming up to World War II Britain, who implemented a strict rationing policy, were the farthest thing from communists. It was not ideological, it was practical. And I think that we could sell it that way. So I am going to conclude by saying that inspired by wartime British food and by other initiatives around the world for our really what is a desperate climate situation and for fairer food, I dearly hope that we can be bold and work for systems that expect a lot of each other and of ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. I'm just going to do clapping here and then jazz hands here just to say thank you very much. I'm going to encourage people to put your questions into the Q&A box, not into the chat. We've had a few people putting things into the chat, but please put them into the Q&A box if you can. There's quite a few that have already come through. Please do continue to put your comments and questions in there. We'll try to get to as many as possible over the next while. I've been grouping them as they've been coming through, and I've got a few different places I can start. But again, thank you, Eleanor, for giving such an interesting talk. It illuminates your book and the arguments that you've had in your book. Of course, we've not had time to go into as much detail as is within there, but it's great to have those highlights. So let's have a look and see what we can come to in terms of the different questions. So how about we start with the cow in the room instead of the elephant in the room. So about half of the questions and comments were around your rationing proposal or the place of meat in this system and what we can learn from that. So shall we start with the cow in the room, as it were? So Christopher Stopes was one of the first commenters on this area. They highlight that the white meats of pork and chicken could be cut back, no regrets, but how do you think about, or how do you square the circle of grass-fed ruminants as a sequestering of carbon, and thinking about beef, lamb, and dairy as these high carbon impacts? And I guess he sums up saying, less meat, yes, but where's the discussion of better meat? Could you provide more of a comment and nuance around this?
Right.
And I guess I'll highlight from my own perspective, the graph you put up there was from the Poor and Nemechek paper, which, you gave the global average, and the graph behind that as well shows there's a huge variety in where animal-based proteins are processed. So there's a big range of carbon impacts for any of these sorts of things. So it's just understanding, I guess, the nuances around your argument, or giving you space and capacity to start there. There are other meat issues ones, but I guess it's thinking at the other one I'll highlight at the moment, if that's okay, to kind of cluster a few for you to go through. Would that be okay? Before we start, or do you want to
I
answer Christopher for now?
yeah, could I start here?
Perfect.
I am delighted that there is emphasis and so much global discourse on better meat. I don't think anyone needs to be vegetarian or vegan who does not wish to do so. The discussion around grass-fed meat is extremely useful. Grass-fed meat gets us away from some of the cruelty of factory farming and does recognize that some lands are suited to ruminant grazing. I do think we need to be careful about some of the claims of the regenerative agriculture movement. I think there may be a little too much enthusiasm. We'll see. I'm not sure quite that much carbon can be sequestered in the soil. I may be wrong, but I think we need to be careful. Mostly, however, when I hear people talk about regenerative agriculture, and once again, thrilled to see the discussion, I don't hear we need to eat much less meat if we are going to raise it regeneratively. The amount of land required, the planet doesn't have it, which is not to say we cannot regeneratively raise animals and meat, but that as part of the package, a cutback, a significant cutback in meat consumption needs to be part of the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So I guess going from that, you've highlighted that a significant part needs to be. We've had a few more questions come in during that point, but I think I'll go to a set of subsection of questions which are talking about dairy in particular. And so a few of people are highlighting, in terms of a few of the different questions we've come through, are highlighting, shouldn't milk also be rationed? Lots of cows, old dairy cows, cows for meat, veal, that sort of intersection of different questions. And then also other people are highlighting the role of fermented dairy versus conventional dairy, and thinking around future food systems and other modes of production. But I guess it's just highlighting the role of dairy in this discussion, as well as animal proteins from flesh.
May I say something? Yeah, wonderful. I tend to simplify the discussion by simply saying meat, but absolutely, animal source foods generally all need to be considered. Even seafood, even fish and seafood, of which stocks of which of course we're over. There's the stocks have been depleted in so many parts of the world. But dairy is an essential discussion. Thank you. It's based on livestock, which are large methane producers. Dairy cows require tremendous amounts of land and food intake to provide the dairy that they do. They also produce a tremendous amount of that uncomfortable topic, manure. So yes, I agree that it is an important part of the discussion. Now, as far as fermented, sorry, can't comment on those details. I'm sure that others can. And I really feel that we've got 69 computers on. There's so much expertise out there that that I may not necessarily have in these details. And I encourage any comments, suggestions, not necessarily questions. Thank you for those questions about dairy.
Thank you very much for those answers as well. So I think let's move away from the meat consumption piece for now. There's a few more questions coming through, and we might come back to this later on today, but just trying to give us a range of questions that we've received. I would like, because we're at the Centre for Food Policy, to move towards some policy-based questions in terms of interrogating your thesis, thinking about what happened historically, how that can be applied today, and thinking about those policy levers. And so an anonymous attendee highlighted, how could a government introduce taxes on popular foods? It sounds like a real vote loser. Many of these interventions would also be economically damaging to businesses. And I think we can kind of see that in, say, the beverage plan of the 1940s, and then the destruction of the Labour government in the 1950s election. So just thinking back to your idea for a start, how does this work in today's environment? Just to allow you to expand on your current thesis, and then I'll go into some other policy questions if that works.
Okay, what wonderful questions. I think almost any move that a government makes is going to be unpopular with some. Balancing competing priorities is part of the job. Yes, limiting production or consumption of some foods, especially these foods, meat and dairy, which I want to say are very elemental and I recognize feed much into individual identity and notions of masculinity, and I absolutely particularly difficult. I think that policymakers need to do the very difficult work of figuring out which demographics, which groups are going to find it popular, because some will, and figure out how to amplify those. Nothing easy here. Could it be difficult for business? Absolutely. And that is painful to me. But every time we get a social change, which involves a product, tobacco is an excellent example. There were people who were tobacco farmers, had been for generations. They thought they were doing a service to society. I think our governments and our societies need to assist generously transitions in business, and really figure out how to do that. I'm in British Columbia. We cut down a lot of trees. I mean, one of our jobs is to help workers in forestry with what we call just transitions, to help them train for something new, to help them do something different. None of this is easy. Absolutely. Great questions.
Well, I'll launch off what you've just said there. So there was a choice of two questions where we go next, but you've just mentioned just transitions. So I think that's a really good place to ask our next question. So one of the questions came through from Eon Heffernan around different sorts of ways government policymakers are feeding into problems. So providing subsidies for inefficient food producers, such as the previous CAP in the EU, so the Common Agricultural Policy. So thinking about where we've come from with organizations such as the CAP, policies that set up inefficient practices, thinking back to your thesis is drawing on the 1940s, how all of this started with the FAO, etc. What are the policies we need to learn from that they may have implemented incorrectly? For where are these policies need to go now? If we're talking about just transitions, what are the policies at local, national, international regulator levels that we need to start deploying?
Excellent question. And I'm not sure I have enough detailed knowledge of that policy background to help. Honestly, I would love to look into some of my excellent resources and respond later to the questioner. At the consumer level, there were constant tweaks to the programs as the government realized it had made a mistake. Rationing was too strict. They needed to introduce a point system for goods that came in occasionally, tinned salmon and other, so that they were flexible. But as to policies on the production side, I don't think I can address it well right now. If you could be more specific.
No, that's helpful, yeah. I think. But and again, Eon, please do comment again, maybe in the Q&A, and we can flesh this out further with thoughts. You've had a thought.
Christian, may I say something? The resource that I discovered during this project were absolutely wonderful, many of them written by UK scholars. And I'm going to write a blog post on eleanorboyle.com within the next 24 hours, listing a couple of points. But more than that, a lot of beautiful resources that some of you and your predecessors have written about this story, so that I'm hoping some of your questions could also be answered there.
Okay, no, thank you very much. I'm very torn as to the direction to take this question next. I was going to take it in one direction. No, I'm going to stick to the big systems questions before we get any narrower. Hopefully you're having fun, all of you at home, and you as well, Eleanor. This is providing some really interesting insight on the thesis that you've just been talking about. So, Amanda Edmonds, this is going to be a combination question. So Amanda Edmonds at 5:59 was talking about crisis-driven transformation. So thinking about COVID, thinking about food-based crisis management. And I'm now trying to scroll up because right at the beginning, there was another questioner who was asking a similar sort of question. So I'm just trying to find it in the questions battery here. But it was just in terms of thinking about food system change from a crisis point of view, and I cannot find it now. So this is on me for not being as effective in terms of linking the questions together. But thinking about what policy is coming about because of a crisis versus policy that comes about because of more stagnant, say, policy cycles, etc. You're seeming to propose that a lot of these big changes, Ministry of Food, etc., happened because of this wider crisis. How does that link? And I think this is where the question was, with the climate crisis, where it is a much longer crisis that may not be directly resolved. And that's what I'm trying to find now, the question. So it's not something that will end just like that. So how does this differ, I guess, today's crisis? And how does that change your, sorry.
Yeah, there are numerous people who've written about climate crisis as analogous to World War II. And I agree that they're not a perfect analogy by any means, as is always true in history. But crisis is also opportunity, and the climate problem is being recognized sufficiently now as crisis that I believe we have opportunities for bolder policy than we might in a normal time. I'm going to stop there.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Shall we change?
Sir, Christian, I am going to say one more thing. It's true that there are many around the world who do not recognize climate or the injustices in our food systems as crisis. How do we make that happen? We need to convince more of our leaders. A lot of it is leadership. I talked about Lord Woolton, not just because it was sort of warm and he was a warm and fuzzy guy, but because we need leaders who can trust and even like. People loved him. Could we find such leaders that would say the difficult and have it heard? I recognize the Democratic election cycle makes it very difficult. Great questions, hard to answer.
No, thank you very much. We've still got many more questions coming in. This is brilliant. Thank you all for engaging so much with this topic. So I'm trying to actively triage as things are coming through. We've got a group of 2 questions around, I guess, the inverse of the cow in the room, as it were, which is thinking about lentils. It's thinking about pulses. And so right at the beginning of this talk, there was discussion around about access to lentils, food consumption of lentils. And then more recently, there's been a discussion, where are we going? Angela Carnaccio is highlighting about how do we engage people to eat more lentils. If you think about, say, Woolton pie and those sorts of things, it was lentils, potato, onions mashed together, if I'm correct. Food historians will strike me down for not having the correct recipe there. But thinking about how do we get the population to eat more lentils? There's some, and Angela has highlighted and shared that some of her clients don't like to eat them because they produce maybe personal externalities of gas flow. But likewise, there are big food system positives there. So a few different people are saying if they're not eating animal-based
Yeah.
products, how do we move them towards this? And what does that even look like?
Lentils are fabulous food, and thank you for raising them. Canada is an enormous producer of lentils, and some of your countries may be as well. And I doubt that lentil producers in Canada get nearly the subsidies and the financial help that our meat industry does. Attitudes need to change at government levels. Which food sectors should we be supporting and subsidizing? Which should we not be? These actions are always multifaceted. The changes to our national food guide were huge. Our new national food guide, which I mentioned, now says most of your protein should come from plant-based sources. Every one of these is another piece in the puzzle. I think we all in the food movement can play a role. We use expressions like food is a personal choice. And I think that's really problematic. I mean, I don't see choosing to eat meat at every meal as something that only affects the eater. It definitely affects other people on the planet. And of course, much of it does not spring from some sort of existential locus of free will. It stems from advertising, a lot of it. So I think we can question some of the language that we use. And I will just say one more thing. There's so many wonderful initiatives around the world. Some of you are involved in them. And one is called Veg Default. And there are a couple of other names for it. There are a number of different groups pushing this. And what they're trying to get organizations to do is serve vegetarian meals unless you ask for meat. So it flips the norm. Rather than the norm being meat, and you have to ask for a vegetarian meal on airlines, for example, should you get a meal, you get a veggie meal unless you ask for meat. Meat is fine, you can have it, you just have to ask for it. So changing these norms is really difficult, but we have changed all kinds of social norms in our world over the last few decades. Not impossible. So action at many levels.
Thank you very much for that. And again, you're touching on a lot of different aspects here in regards to expanding on what you presented there. I want to just go from lentils through to kind of the countryside we want to live in, as it were. So Teresa Haddon at 554 asked this discussion on meat maintains a pretty landscape. Ending it would cover the landscape with brambles and ferns. The problem is not a simple matter. Do you agree? You're welcome to answer that. But I think the complexity of this is as well as what is that land used for? And I think if we take that wider landscape of saying the 1940s, 1950s saw a massive amount of technological change. After that, the Green Revolution came. I guess from your thesis saying we have this shock happening in the war, it changed things. We now have this shock. We need to be changing things again. How does your new diet, this planetary health diet, how does that make the countryside look? How does that make rural communities operate? So take it from your own community, take it from a UK community. Would you want to expand on that discussion? So please feel free to respond to Teresa, but I think the point behind her question is, what sort of landscape are we wanting, and do lentils fit into that? Do other forms of agriculture fit into that? I think Libby Oakden's question previously on fermented milks as well fit into this kind of discussion, and it would be great to hear kind of your views on that.
Good. Teresa, wonderful, complex questions. Yeah, it's lovely to travel through the countryside and see a few grazing ruminants. Unfortunately, we don't see that because in this part of the world, it's all factory farms. We drive through rural areas and we see large buildings that animals are stuffed into. So that, in a sense, once we can figure out how to regulate factory farming, it will not change the landscape for the worse, for sure. Again, I think that animals intelligently and compassionately organized have a place in human society and food systems. I believe that, and I would be happy to see ruminants grazing in our countrysides. As far as how the land will be used, because should we cut back on production and consumption of meat, there will be enormous tracts of land worldwide that are now available that used to grow crops for ruminants and pigs and chickens as well. A lot of them should be rewilded. A lot of them should be rewilded, as the group in Nature talks about, as many other scholars talk about. We need more oxygen producing greenery. So I think that our rural areas could be greener. And believe me, I don't think that this is easy. But I think that our rural areas could be just as prettier.
Thank you very much for that, Eleanor. And again, please do respond again in the chat if you want, and we'll try and create a bit of a dialogue happening here. Again, please do keep putting your questions into the comments. We've still got a huge audience here engaging with us, and there are so many different things coming through in the Q&A. And it seems also in the chat box, it seems there's a bit of a promotion of different people or different organizations doing the right thing. So again, hopefully that's not too distracting to everybody to focus on the screen as well as all these different bits of information, but it seems people are mentioning different organizations in the UK and global food system doing the right thing and sharing some brilliant links there. Shall we go to the other, I don't want to say elephant in the room, but the other hot topic at the moment, it seems, on food policy and food systems Twitter, it seems that ultra-processed food is one of the big buzz points or hot points. And an anonymous attendee has just written in to look and say there have been lots of news items about the negative impacts of ultra-processed food, which possibly includes alternative proteins, and also some forms of dietary shift that you might be proposing may include ultra-processed food. So they're asking about how can this be addressed in terms of ultra-processed food linking through to climate diets? Do you have any views on this in terms of your understanding of how it would fit into kind of your ideal food system? I personally have my own views, but I think we can have a natter about that after your own response.
I'd like to hear yours as well. There is criticism of plant-based proteins for being overly processed. Absolutely. And I think we're going to get better. Those who are in the business are going to get better at that. But when people say that I won't eat a veggie burger because it has 10 ingredients, I'd rather have a beef burger. I say, do you know what the ingredients are in the beef burger? Most of the world's agricultural land, most of the world's fresh water. There are a lot of unspoken, invisible ingredients in meat. Again, I'm not against meat eating. I just think that we have to be cautious about critiques of what are really solutions in the making. It's all a work in progress, but and overprocessing is a problem for health, for environment. But I think we have to be careful about being too critical of the initial stages of plant-based proteins. That said, ultra-processed foods, I'm really happy to see a discussion, big discussion about that now. We must make and eat fewer processed foods. And it's one of the, it wasn't really an issue in World War II Britain, although they did eat processed foods. But now it's a real health and environmental problem. So thank you for raising it. I think that's all I'd say.
I might hold you to account there and say, well, from my personal viewpoint, ultra-processed foods were alive and well in World War II, powdered egg. for want of a better example, margarine, the mainstay of the ration. I would debate that and say over 50% of the calories in the ration pack were probably ultra processed. But that's me getting slightly cheeky and probably a pub conversation for you to have there rather than anything else. But again, it shows you ultra processed foods have been with us in the food system for quite a while. And I would highlight possibly that there's differences of corporate power, corporate consolidation, those different sorts of things. Alicia Weston is highlighting powdered egg is not ultra processed, it's minimally processed. Okay, again, I'm not a nutrition scientist and I'm not up on my NOVA classifications as well as I should be. And Christopher Stopes also highlighting there. My apologies to the chat, I've got that wrong, obviously. But again, this shows you some of the divisions around NOVA. I was going to go to a comment with it from an anonymous attendee asking about how can leaders, sorry, you've asked and said as one of your main things that leadership needs to be bold. And I guess from my point of view at the Centre for Food Policy, it's not just about single policy or political leaders. And an anonymous attendee has asked, how can leaders in the food community and the public convince government that these interventions need to happen? Is there any wider thoughts that you want to share around examples from previously or from now around the different roles of leadership within the food system? So it not just being about policymakers, but the wider food community that you want to share.
There are others here whose views I would love to hear, including Professor Emeritus Tim Lang and others who have years of experience in this. I think I would say that it's sometimes shocking that so many of our political leaders don't get food. They don't really know much about it. So we go some way toward our aims by simply informing, by speaking about it more, by making appointments with our members of parliament and giving them information. We don't have to tell them we think they should ration foods. But it's actually shocking sometimes how little public figures know about food, so we can do something to inform. It's it's even shocking how little food activists know about, say, meat and dairy, which for quite a number of reasons has been sidelined over the years. So we can inform, and beyond that, I'm going to have to defer to the full-time policy experts in the group.
All good, all good. It was just highlighting that one of your central theses being this leadership role, and it's great to see that the chat have picked up on the wider community that needs to show leadership, just as you've said. Andrea Zick, right at the beginning of this, you picked up that brilliant emotive picture of the boys digging out the rubble to create a allotment, the Grow for Victory, Dig for Victory campaign, etc. And so Andrea is asking right at the beginning of the talk, she's curious to understand what happened to all these growing spaces in places like Albert Memorial in London. When did the public lose access to them? Is it because the people who had these spaces stopped giving them access to grow things? Or was it that, just the food system changed after the war and rationing started to be eased, etc.? Do you have any insights into this?
I don't know specifically. I'll simply say a few things. The rationing, of course, did not stop immediately post-war, which I'm sure a lot of you know. Some items were rationed right into the early 50s. And life was still really tough in late 40s into the 50s and beyond, so that some people probably continued to grow their own. As far as public parks, they were eventually turned back to grass or whatever, and I suspect part of it was psychological, that the British population, for many of you, your parents, your grandparents, they were so exhausted from the war, exhausted, that they didn't really want to be reminded of it. So it may have been doing a public service to turn some of those allotment gardens into something just a little prettier. But more detailed than that, I can't say. It's a wonderful question.
No, well, thank you very much for that additional detail. Just in terms of highlighting the changing landscape of London, as it were, after the growing. Sorry, just going through the plethora of different questions. We still have 21 questions to get through in 9 minutes, so it's figuring out what we can get through in time. But please, people, keep putting them into the chat. I can see there's others within the sorry. Please put them into the Q&A box, not the chat. There we go. So we have a few in terms of talking around the differences between regenerative agriculture and organic growing, and how these may be co-opted by different groups, or the effectiveness of these different wider ways of agriculture. Do you have anything to say in terms of that? Because we've got a few different questions in terms of if you're thinking about doing these large agricultural shifts to organic practices or regenerative agriculture, some of these terms have been possibly co-opted by specific groups. But likewise, is there a specific way of farming that you are proposing in this book? Because you used a few different words in your discussion.
Yeah. Farming methodology is complex, and there are people on this call who are probably expert at it. I do not propose a particular method or series of methods. It is certainly true that some of these ideas can be co-opted, say, by industry to greenwash, to make it look that they are appear that they are eco-friendly. So we always need to be cautious about that. But as well, there are complexities and nuances and competing priorities, and it may be that organic works in some areas and regenerative would work better than in others. So I think I'd better not say more than that, not an expert in that area, but you've raised some good points.
Thank you very much for highlighting that. And again, we've done such a wide range of different questions. I thank everybody for putting into the chat. And I thank you, Eleanor, for responding with all of these different examples. Just going through and trying to find. So I'll highlight that Tim has put a comment, not a question, into the chat. Do you mind if I just read that out? So that's from Professor Tim Lang. So Tim said, the rationing issue goes to the heart of the cultural dimensions of diet and food systems. There are big differences between now and the 1940s in skills, food tastes, and assumptions. Rationing in World War II was built on 3 years of rationing in World War I, only 20 years earlier. But today, virtually nobody's experienced rationing, and it ended in 1954. So isn't rationing issue an impossible shift to win? There have been something, but his text has been cut off there. Sorry, there has been 60 years of consumerism and consumer choice ideology since World War II. So again, I think, Eleanor, you've framed this in terms of that consumeristic drive. But I'll also highlight that many of your examples were for public goods rather than private goods. So in terms of thinking a library card, there's a certain number of library books in the public sphere. And this was one of the anonymous commenters was highlighting this in terms of saying meat, dairy, etc. These are private goods. This would be rationing at its core. Would that work today? So just to respond to that commenter, as well as what Tim's been saying about we've got 60 years of ideology. So do you want a last few minutes to be able to respond to kind of Tim's thoughts there, but also this commenter who was highlighting the different sorts of goods that are available, public versus private, and how this affects companies in particular?
Great points. Thank you to the viewer for pointing out that my examples of rationing are in the public sphere. I'll need to do some thinking about that. It's a very good one. And let me just say to that, it may be that we need to do a better job of pointing out the public nature of these foods that we purchase, the public planet and resources that go explicitly to produce these, and attempt to counter this notion of individualism and consumer right. I mean, I'm sitting in North America. This is the heart of individualism. And believe me, this is difficult. Tim, wonderful comment. Thank you so much. Yes, we have decades of, did you say consumer of ideology, and that people in wartime had not been brainwashed to be the kinds of consumers that we expect to be today. Very difficult. I'm not sure what to say, except that I always want to take a problem and see if you can't use the problem to your social ends. Is there some way that we could use an individualism and an enthusiastic consumerism to somehow get to the ends that we seek? I'm not sure, but wonderful points. Thank you, Tim.
No, well, thank you again, Eleanor, for putting together your argument, and you're writing such a wonderful book. It was a joy to read over my paternity leave, I've got to say. So with all of that in mind, I think we're coming to an end. We've got 1 or 2 minutes left, and we've still got 20 or so questions left to go through. So I don't think we're going to get through all of them, but I feel we've traveled and hit most of the different notes. I'm mindful that we've not really touched on food loss and waste in terms of some of the questions you've highlighted. We've also got some other discussions around school food education and school meals that we've not talked about. Is there anything more you'd like to either expand in terms of how food loss and waste and reducing that might fit in, or kind of how your thesis is looking at education specifically? I know we've got 3 minutes. Would you like to choose one of those two to kind of round us out with? Because we've had questions on both of those.
I tend to focus on meat because it is the controversial piece that people don't want to talk about, so I'm happy to talk about it. But food waste, food loss and waste is absolutely essential to tackle. Beyond excessive meat production, food loss and waste is the largest food-related contributor to the climate crisis. And the thing is, it's kind of a slam dunk. Psychologically, socially, no one would disagree that it is a waste of resources and it's a moral tragedy when people are hungry. I think at the consumer level, people have become more aware of minimizing food waste. And in fact, there is a mandate here in my jurisdiction, and I'm sure in some others. It is now illegal to throw food waste into the garbage, the trash. One must put it into compost, and the city composts it all. How to get at waste at a larger level, I don't know. Christian, I know that you and an international team published that remarkable book on food loss and waste, and probably have more thoughts on dealing with this at a high level. But it really is fertile ground for change, because you're not going to get much opposition. Yeah, let's go to it, and I'm sure that your work can help.
Oh, thank you very much for that. But again, I'm only here to moderate tonight. I'm not here to be trying to preach. It's about your argument and presenting that and being able to respond to these amazing questions. And well, we're coming up to about 60 seconds left to go on this talk, as it were. But I guess from my point of view, and I think everybody is expressing their delight in how well this is going, and people are saying continue and things like that. But I think we have to keep to time. Can I again, from everybody here at the Centre for Food Policy, thank you very much for presenting tonight on Food Thinkers. This has been an absolute joy to hear your arguments. And please do go out, get the book, and again, do look at this and others once it gets posted to YouTube. Please do engage with all of this. Thank you so much for presenting tonight. I'm going to give jazz hands. Maybe at home everybody else can jazz hands and applause for yourself, Eleanor. It's been brilliant to have you here presenting tonight. Oh, you've got one more thing to mention. Shall I do the housekeeping and say the next Food Thinkers is October 25th? The invites for that will come out shortly. You've got something to say now, Eleanor. Take it away.
I have a blog at eleanorboyle.com on my website. I will be posting on this with a lot of references and resources, including links for anyone who wants to read more. And I welcome comments and disagreements and complaints and anything else so that we can keep talking about these things. Thank you so much.
Lovely. No, thank you. It's already gone into the chat for people to look at. We'll also post it with the YouTube video, a link to your blog. Again, thank you very much, Eleanor. Thank you all for attending. This is Dr. Christian Reynolds from the Centre for Food Policy, signing off for the evening. Bye.